Good evening and welcome to tonight's meeting of the Lake Bluff Public Library Board of Trustees. I call this meeting to order on Wednesday, June 21st at 8:03 p.m.
Trustee Shaw.
Here.
Trustee Church.
Here.
Trustee Friedman. Here. Trustee Bird. Here. Trustee Hayes. Absent. And Trustee Dowdy and Graziano.
You have a quorum.
Do have.
I'd like to welcome everybody to give the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you.
Okay, any additions and corrections to our agenda tonight? Okay, hearing none. Do we have anyone from the public who wishes to address the board?
I'm gonna check on Zoom.
Okay, hearing none, seeing none. Then we'll move to agenda item 6, presentation of the new user suspension policy by our library director, Renee.
Thank you. You all have a copy of the memo I sent trustees. I am going to review the memo in this meeting for the public and read it forth for the additional context for the public. This is context for the new user suspension policy for the Lake Bluff Public Library and some background and context for the presentation of this new policy. All members of the public have the right to visit public library buildings, utilize their facilities, and enjoy library services that are provided to the public. As a way to communicate expectations for behaviors while users are in the building or on the property, libraries have policies in place that inform the public and explain appropriate usage of library facilities. Library employees, led by their library directors, are tasked with important and necessary responsibilities to determine when members of the public have violated these policies and act on those violations to ensure the safety of staff, library property, and the public. It is best practice, therefore, that public libraries have board-approved policies in place that provide clear procedures and guidance for employees in determining if a suspension is warranted. Lake Bluff Public Library does not currently have such a policy. In the fall of 2022, as staff and board navigated an incident with a user suspension, this gap in policy was determined to be significant, and as a result, the library did not have that policy. At the time, the organization was led by an interim director, and the decision was made with legal counsel not to move forward with developing a user suspension policy at that time, given the extenuating circumstances of staffing limitations and increased workload. In addition, the organization's bylaws and policy committee was not a standing committee, rather it was only an ad hoc committee. Shortly after the new library director was hired, she identified several policy gaps in the organization, including making the bylaws and policy committee a standing committee, which is now chaired by Alexander Friedman. This ensures, as she advised the board, that a schedule of policy review be established to ensure the organization was in a more proactive, compliant place with timely and community responsive policies. Moreover, the Special Topics Committee, the ad hoc committee that formed as a result of the fall 2022 incident, discussed that the group's final report should include a strong recommendation to the board that a suspension policy be researched, drafted, and put in place as soon as possible. This report was drafted by the chair of the Special Topics Committee at that time and was shared with the library director in May of 2022. It is yet to be shared with the board, but it will soon be shared with the board when it's finalized. An incident occurred at the Lake Bluff Public Library on Friday, June 16th, that precipitated a discussion between the library director and the current library board president about the lack of policy and the organization's need to move forward with another user suspension. This is the context for why this newly drafted policy is in front of the board today. So the goals of the policy are to provide clear and concrete guidelines for library board trustees, library director, and employees in managing violations of library policy and making decisions about user suspensions. And it also provides transparent expectations to the community about the Lake Bluff Public Library's commitment to safety, managing violations of policy, and its commitment to providing a safe and welcoming environment that encourages the use of library services, materials, and facilities to the fullest extent. Thank you. So with that, this policy was drafted by myself with a variety of research done using other libraries' suspension policies as reference. And I do want to highlight there is a level of variation across libraries in their development of this policy. Some are very specific about what violations constitute what level of bannings and time restrictions for those violations, while others have chosen to be more generic and providing the discretion to the director and library employees. So this particular policy was drafted for your review tonight with instead of a more specific policy in mind about specific violations, receiving specific timeframes. What this does is outline the different amounts of time that a person could be suspended and talks about what types of offenses those could be, but not necessarily limited to. And it provides direction for the trustees in terms of what their responsibilities are after 6 months. And it also provides a level of clarity to the community about what library employees are supported in doing and what the director and the trustees are authorized to do by state statute. I'm going to check Zoom. I heard a noise earlier, so I just want to make sure everybody's in the meeting. But at this time, I would open the floor for questions or discussion. You can open the floor. Sorry.
No, that's quite all right. That's quite all right. I did have an opportunity to review this policy when it was in draft, and my recommended sort of clarifications, the comments are in it already. So I look forward to, you know, making it better with your additional comments tonight. So I don't have any extensive comments.
I should also say all board members received a copy of this policy and were encouraged to send any questions or clarifications to me via email. So reporting today, I have received none via email since that was invited of the Board of Trustees. So there is nothing to share from the other trustees at this time.
I'm gonna check my phone for any clarification that our attorneys have been able to provide on the term willfully.
Yes.
Excuse me.
The only thing, and this is just on my mind because I just came out of a history museum meeting, that this policy, if anybody is banned from the library, it would be from both the library and the museum and the grounds. That would mean that, were you to say that the policy would be shared with all library trustees and library employees, it should also be shared with the museum staff.
Yes, and Trustee George is referencing the memo I sent to, is that correct?
Yes.
As opposed to the policy, but yes, absolutely. I will make sure that, so the executive director of the museum and I have already spoken. So thank you for that reminder that it will be shared with museum board and staff.
The policy will be shared, or
After review and approval that it will be shared, and any notification of suspensions. Yes, is that what you're?
Yes, they don't expect to be consulted in the policy. That's our wheelhouse to make a policy.
Mhm.
But since they will be under the same guidelines, they would like to know what the policy is, what the guidelines are for implementing it, should anybody come in and they should be notified if there are any individuals who are under suspension.
Is there any issue with privacy or information sharing there outside? Well, it's your physical building, but organizations?
That's what I was wondering about.
So we do intend to send the policy for legal review tonight if the board approves a version of it. We gave the attorneys a heads up 2 days ago that this policy was coming in soon, along with the meeting room policy and the public comment policy. We just said, please prioritize the user suspension policy because we do want to have that pushed as soon as possible, since it's come, it's not an update to another policy, it kind of has higher relevance right now. So we have asked for clarification on the word willfully. We can also ask for clarification on privacy.
And I think this would be more related to the procedure of implementing the
Yeah.
policy,
Yes.
just to provide that clarification, but yes, we would need that, counsel.
So we will not be including that specification in the policy with the museum as part of the procedural.
Right, I think Janie was citing just next steps in terms of the memo, so I made a note for our internal procedures, if and when this is approved. To share the policy at the very least with the museum, to share that an individual was banned, but any further communication about specifics about the individual will have to connect with our legal counsel first, because of the right to privacy, patron privacy in the library. Good luck. Thank you, Janie, for that.
Any other comments?
One question, in the event of the suspension longer than 3 days, the suspended individual may appeal the decision at a regularly scheduled board meeting. In the event that a patron is suspended tomorrow, we don't have a regularly scheduled board meeting for a month. How would that appeal process work? So let's say if they were suspended for 7 days, they wouldn't have an opportunity to appeal it then, their suspension. No.
Remind me again.
It's
what
on the
paragraph?
last paragraph on the first page.
Yes, so I wonder if we need to discuss the length of time of that suspension, if 3 days is the appropriate amount of time to provide an appeals process. So appeals is a right of the patrons as referred to in the Open Meetings Act. But we probably need to clarify, because you're absolutely right, just logistically, it doesn't work out in that time frame.
Or would we request that then a special meeting could be called and requested in writing?
That is within the purview of the board, so yeah, that would be possible.
Or we could we say suspensions of 30 days or more can be appealed?
Yeah, the question I had was about the length of time, so.
And then any suspension should, or 31 days, 32 days, stretch to another board meeting. Let's say the suspension begins the day of a board meeting. I guess if we do 31 days.
I'd feel comfortable after consulting the Open Meetings Act, just to be sure if they stipulate the time period. And what is within your purview as a board to determine the length of time that needs to pass for an appeals process to happen? Or is the requirement just that you have an appeals process for a given amount of time? And I need to do some further research there.
Remind me where the appeals language is.
Last paragraph, first page, and then into
Series or in the event. There.
in the event, and then
8 hours prior to the meeting. So that means that if someone were suspended for 4 days, they could submit an appeal request within 2 days of that, but then by the time of the meeting, then
One thing I mentioned at last night's board meeting is there is a free Open Meetings Act hotline available for library directors through Rails, our consortium, and I've used them in consultation, and so it's a free service provided by a local legal counsel called Ansel and Glick, and it's a service for all Rail members. So I can definitely reach out to them and get that clarification.
So I guess the question is, do we approach this as change in the duration of suspension that can be appealed? Or do we change the way it gets appealed such that if it is a 3-day or a 7-day suspension that can be appealed, that maybe it goes to the library director, but suspensions of 30 days or more, the appeal goes to the board.
Okay. Because the library director can, the language here, it says can impose a 30-day suspension up to 6 months,
Mhm.
it would be within that
The given
range.
policy.
Yeah, and that the same, it could be the same process of 48 hours before a board meeting or less than 30 days.
Mhm.
Determine what you think an appropriate appeals period would be for you.
Mhm.
I have a quick question. So it says trespassing on library property following the notice suspension, increasing suspension. Sorry. Like, the question is, where's the teeth in? Like, where? How? Do we keep? How do we, if there's a suspension, how do we make sure that it's validated or that it's followed?
So that's part of the procedure that I implement with library staff. If there is a notice of suspension, all staff have the name of this individual, a physical description. We don't currently have cameras on our property for surveillance, but in previous libraries, there's often like a snapshot of that individual. And so then any staff member in that instance would be authorized to escort this individual out and provide a verbal indication of trespassing, and then the director would follow. Some of the, one of the things I talked about with Bonnie in our pre-review is some libraries are very specific about if trespassing occurs, it doubles the suspension length. That was one of the examples we reviewed. One of the things we talked about was that do we want to provide that level of specificity in the policy, or do we just want to say it increases depending on the situation? So there's flexibility and openness for the director to make calls with consultation with the board president and the board. We can be as specific as we want to, but again, getting back to your original question, it would be the library's responsibility in our procedures and managing and monitoring library use as we do to notify the director in the event that an individual does trespass after a suspension letter has been issued.
I guess my questions are about paragraphs 3 and 4 of the suspension policy, proposed suspension policy. I'm wondering what sort of violations would result in an up to 24 hours. What would be the sort of violation that would be a 30-day suspension, either for repeat offenders or a more serious violation? You clearly considered the 6-month suspension for the incident of last Friday. The one last fall resulted in a year. But I'm curious as to what levels of
Yeah,
misbehavior would be examples that would, because I'm not sure. I'm just not sure what would get you a 24-hour stop on hand.
I'll give you an example. Having worked in youth services departments before, we have active teens in the library. Two individual teens might get into a verbal argument with each other. They've been asked to use the appropriate volume in the library, not use any derogatory words at each other. They've been given 2 warnings, and after those 2 warnings, it continues. They've been asked to leave. And so a lot of restorative justice practices talk about the rebuilding of trust with youth and the idea that, okay, I'm going to stand firm with our boundaries in the library and you are expected to follow these rules. I'm appreciating that you are here. I want you to come back. These are what we expect of you the next day. And then the next day you start on a clean slate. So that is my most, that's where a lot of my experience lies in suspensions.
So if someone was asked to leave, would that be written down? In an
Yes.
incident report?
Yes.
Okay, so it wouldn't, if somebody came back the next day and there was somebody different at the desk. say,
Yes,
for instance.
and that's exactly why we've included the responsibility of staff to follow internal, let's see, the last sentence of the 3rd paragraph. And will document incidents of user suspension through the library's incident report procedure, which is filling out a form, a description of the individual, and that being shared internally with all staff on the staff log.
Okay, so what about a 30-day
Um,
or a more serious, what would be a more serious violation?
So other experiences I've had are related to language shared to staff directly. Sometimes there are individual.
Sorry.
No, you're fine. No, you're right on. So sometimes there are very heated and passionate conversations, especially when discussing fees that a user is owed. We don't have any fines at the library, but if a person loses multiple items and that accrues over time, maybe they haven't come to the library over several years and then they come back and they've forgotten that they still owe. You know, we can give examples of COVID. People not happy about the guidelines that the library put in place. Something like that could be, and it depends on the situation, depends what words were used. Was this person physically aggressive? Did they come into the side of the staff desk, or did they stand on the other side? Each situation is quite unique and requires a very specific level of judgment with the managers and, with the director. Those would be a couple examples.
And then Jamie, the other possibility outlined here on the policy is a repeat offender. So if
Yes.
somebody's is, behaving inappropriately, is aggressive with a patron, it happens again and again and again, we might say, okay, we need to push the pause button and suspend
Right.
your use.
So I guess that was suspended for 1 day several times. I guess several times is a little.
Yeah. And I think that's, and you all as a board are able to determine the language that you feel is appropriate to guide the policy. And as I said, there was variance in the policies that I've researched. Some are very specific in their language, and others are, to use Janie's word, squishy. I'll share our North Shore neighbors. Lake Forest and Glencoe do not have specific patron suspension policies. Their wording about suspensions are integrated into their code of conduct. My experience working at Glencoe is that it's an occurrence that hasn't happened with any level of frequency. We've had several occurrences within 1 year, and I think that there's less of a risk, and there's even more clarity with regards to the board if you have a very specific, separate, distinct policy for user suspension. As opposed to taking the path that some libraries have and just including a sentence or two about patron suspension. Those libraries have opted to just lean on the direction of the director to handle each individual situation. You know, some libraries have frequent violations on a day-to-day basis, whether it's theft, vandalism, you know, behavior, unattended children. You know, that's actually another thing that could result in a suspension. A parent who regularly comes to the library and doesn't attend to their child under the age of 8, when there's regular conversations with that parent about how they need to supervise their underage child in the library. I've had those experiences too. And you document as that happens. If the repeat offenses keep happening, that could be another example of a user suspension that may not come to mind when we think of, you know, more dangerous or physically aggressive. It would just be another example.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Mhm. Happy to.
I do think it walks the line between, you know, being too prescriptive and, not being too. I think it's in between to give some discretion, with like the points you just made. I do particularly like that it provides like the library director with a lot of discretion up to 6 months. I think that's really important.
So far I've heard support for the policy as written. I've heard a suggestion that appeals of 7 to 30 days go to the library director, and appeals of greater than 30 days go to the board. Just to recap, is that, see, some heads nodding, okay.
Okay, I did not get that. What, greater than 30 days?
So it's about appeals, right? Ally had made the point that if someone has been suspended for 3 days and the only path to appeal is to the board, the suspension is likely going to be over by the time a regularly scheduled board meeting happens. So this is very last sentence. In the event of a suspension, that's where the appeals piece starts. So the suggestion then was appeals begin at 7 days rather than at 3 days.
Oh, okay,
So-
so in events of a suspension longer than 7 days? Is that
Yeah,
your
from
thing?
7 to 30 days, those appeals would go to the director. If someone is suspended for more than 30 days, they may appeal the board at a regularly scheduled board meeting. So it's just going to help close that gap of someone having a 3-day suspension on
Tomorrow.
Wednesday, right, or today and tomorrow. And there would be no recourse for them to appeal because the regular scheduled board meeting doesn't happen for 30, 31 days.
I see, so I'm still not clear on what the person would do then. Would the person would appeal directly to you?
Either, and we can clarify in writing or verbally, you know, if we want to put that level of specificity. Any suspension more than 70 days, 7 days, or up to 30 days, they would appeal in writing or verbal appeal directly to the library director. The way that you said it was much more clear than I'm reiterating right now.
Can I read what I have written?
Yes.
Okay, so any suspension longer than 7 days and less than 30 days can be appealed in writing or verbally directly to the library director. Suspensions greater than 30 days may be appealed to the board with at least 48 hours prior to a regularly scheduled meeting to ensure patrons have the ability to appeal within their suspension period. Is that?
And the 48 hours supports the Open Meetings Act as well, so that item would be on the posted agenda, so that is why that's there.
Jamie, does that answer your question?
I think so. I think it does. Yeah, I,
I think it affords then people equal opportunity, right? The same violation of different days of the month. One of them is getting a better opportunity to appeal versus. the
Right.
one who's not. So
so if somebody who has received a 30-day suspension will have to wait until their 30 days is up to appeal?
no, they could submit their appeal in writing, which means then the board would address it within their suspension
that,
period.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Do not have any answer on my willful question.
Okay, maybe should I
Feel free to check your
will.
email. I only reinstated email on my phone today, and my last email is more than 3 hours ago, which is kind of odd.
Did we update the board about the reason we're asking about the word will?
Sure. So the Illinois library law language in paragraph 2. The second sentence, it starts Illinois library law authorizes the board in consultation with the director to deny such access to a user whose behavior is deemed dangerous, destructive, disruptive, or who otherwise willfully violates the library user conduct policy. We've asked our attorney to clarify how the word willfully has been interpreted. For example, if someone is under the influence of alcohol or drugs or otherwise medicated, are they still considered willful? If someone has an intellectual disability, are they still considered willful? And I think Renee, in your research, did some people had willfully and some people didn't?
Correct, correct. Some libraries decided to literally lift the statute language and put it into their policy, which is what we've done here. It's not in parentheses or quotes, but this is the exact language that comes from the statute. Authorizes the board through the end of the sentence, and the word willfully is in the statute. So the question to our lawyer is, what is the implication and interpretation, and how?
Does willfully apply to the dangerous, destructive, and disruptive though? Because at least the way I read it is that if it's dangerous, disruptive, or destructive, it doesn't matter if it's willful or not.
Correct.
Even if it's the result of a disability or.
Correct.
of-
That's how I read it as well.
Yeah, and I guess so willfully then would be, you've been told 2, 3, however many times not to use certain language, and you're still doing it, you've willfully.
Mhm. Because that example is not,
disruptive.
yeah, that would be disruptive, but this also gives flexibility to each institution to define what their library user conduct policy is, and to say that the library board of trustees is authorized to deny access for people who otherwise violate that policy. Saying local control, the policy is what guides your decision of what's appropriate behavior or not. And then someone who otherwise willfully violates.
So I based on this conversation, and prior to legal input, I'm just curious, what do you all think about this policy with or without the word willfully? Do you have a preference?
I don't, given the interpretation of the first 3 being separate from them. I think if it were deemed to be willfully dangerous, it would be different, but I don't see it. As if especially if it can be referenced back to a statute.
That's a good point. It's not willfully dangerous, willfully destructive, willfully disruptive. It's those 3 things, or otherwise.
Yeah.
Willfully. there are no further questions.
I do have one, go down, it's below halfway through where it says the Board of Trustees approves suspension. Should that say the Board of Trustees must approve suspensions over 6 months?
Well, in precedent, with regards to last fall's incident, it was a year suspension and the board did not approve
I
that.
thought we did.
I was told. I should.
I thought we did approve a 1-year suspension.
No, should we move it to executive session to discuss?
I mean, just getting back to your question, that's what you're asking.
Right.
Should the language be changed? I would defer to the.
Yeah, and Janie, I had some difficulty recalling, I'm not sure if the board did that or if Katie did that, because I know there was at one point a lack of clarity for the interim director as to who could suspend, whether it was for a week, a month, or a year even.
Well, see, that's why I think because it happened on Katie's watch, that I feel like the board, or at least the committee that what do we call it?
Special topics.
Thank you. I thought that was something that special topics committee came out with. Was approved because
Yeah, my recollection is the first suspension was for a week as we sorted through residents, et cetera,
Right.
legal opinion, et cetera. And then the next one, I do recall discussing it at a meeting, but I don't remember.
On October 18th. We came to the decision to suspend the patron from the library building and property indefinitely and review the case after 1 year.
Is there a vote?
What month?
October 2022, October 18th.
so that was just a matter of days after.
Okay, so it's in the minutes that the
There
board did
is
it.
no. There is no
Yeah.
vote recorded.
So then what is your question?
Well, my question is.
Thank you,
That,
Ellen.
that, if we're going to do a suspension of over 6 months. I would assume that means a year or longer, including permanent bans, that must be approved by the Board of Trustees. So instead of saying the Board of Trustees approves suspensions over 6 months, say the Board of Trustees must approve suspension. And I would even, we're not gonna, it's gonna be 6 months or it's gonna be a year. I mean, the 6 months is at your discretion. If it's more serious than that, there's not gonna be something between 6 months and a year.
Most likely no, but the reason I would suggest an alternative here is if it is egregious, if it is a law that is broken, if it is property that is damaged willfully. If police are involved, if it really is truly egregious, would you prefer to wait procedurally for an emergency board meeting to make that decision? That would be the discussion at hand, would be. This provides a little this wording provides a little flexibility for the director to do it if deemed necessary, and it could be always with the consultation of the board president. But to move to something more specific, then that would be the discussion at the table.
I'm a little lost on your response. I hear Janie's ask of, should it be the Board of Trustees must approve any suspension over 6 months? I hear that as the suggested clarification, but
But the
then,
current language doesn't say that. It says
Right.
they approve suspensions over 6 months. But if for some reason a situation was very clear where it warranted at least a year ban immediately, and potentially even discussion of a permanent ban, this language allows for the director to issue that. There's, without saying must.
Wouldn't the director be able to do a 6-month suspension immediately?
Yes.
And revisit to approve a 1-year ban of the board? So it could be a recommendation that the library directors, I recommend
Mhm.
at least a 1-year ban in the interim, the 6-month ban is in place. Until the board meeting is
Mhm.
regularly scheduled.
That's what I understood the policy,
Yeah.
that it's in your sole discretion up to 6 months.
Mhm.
Anything longer than that would come to the full board.
Well, then the language should be more clear, and we should add words like must and will.
I will also just note that the previous or the current suspension policy, which is embedded in the user conduct policy, did not require any sort of board approval for any suspension sentence. So the suspension will last for a period of time designated by the director. And then in the event that the suspension is greater than 3 days, the patron can appeal to the board, but there has not been board involvement in determining the length or issuing a suspension previously or to date.
Okay, so. I'm supportive of the word must going in after the board of trustees must approve suspensions over 6 months. Because your 6 month.
Gives you the window, the opportunity to get the board.
Right.
together.
Gather,
absolutely.
gather the information,
Absolutely.
and then get, present the case to the board. for
Yes.
Anything longer.
Are there other words we should add to clarify that instances? I think just that one word addition
Must-
would
yeah, I
clarify.
take- Must approve. not
Yeah, I just-
approve.
Yes, I should.
I think that's all.
It's great. Thank you.
Any other comments or suggestions? Clarifications? Now I'd be looking for a motion to approve the policy with the agreed upon edits.
I so move.
Okay. I hear a second. Second, okay. It is a policy, so I think we do a roll call, and I just want to confirm the agreed upon changes. First, willfully was a question that we wanted to discuss. We want to keep willfully in there. Number 2, the paragraph beginning, the board of trustees must approve. Change number 2. Change number 3, a little more extensive. I think Ally's got some good language for it. It's in regard to appeals of 7 to 30 days of suspension. Appeals would be directed to the library director, verbally or in writing. Any appeals of greater than 30 days suspension would go to the board in writing 48 hours before our regularly scheduled meeting. Ready for your roll call?
Trustee Shaw, trustee Church,
Aye.
trustee Bird, trustee Friedman, aye. Okay. The amended policy passes.
Ally, would you be able to email me the wording? I know you'll send me the minutes, but that you captured. Thank you.
Okay. Great. Then our next agenda item is executive session if needed.
I wanted to bring up the topic of surveillance cameras. Just throw it out there and see what.
Okay, do you want to do that under any other business, or is there any reason to do it in executive session?
I'm not sure I can answer that question. I think that we can do it. I don't think it need to be an exec session, but we're not
Okay.
discussing. any-
Yeah. Okay, so. Security cameras. Yeah. What are your thoughts? Do they have them in the high school? At the
Sorry?
time that you taught, did they have security cameras in the high school?
Oh, God, yeah.
Okay,
They're all over DP.
yeah, okay, great.
Yes, they are. And I think it's more the exception of the rule now for public buildings to not have surveillance. And with 2 incidents like this within 6 months. Or no more than 6 months, within a year. I would say it's possibly time to consider doing that, having something, at the front door facing the sidewalk. Having something at the circulation desk, having something at up in the mezzanine, having something downstairs.
I agree.
I just don't know what the cost is of something like this, but I think the costs of those sorts of things are greatly reduced over what they used to be.
Hmm.
I definitely feel like maybe the tech committee should
Hmm.
do it. You know, in both of these cases, the person instigating the incident kind of took off.
And the fact finding process, I would believe, is much longer when you don't have camera, because different people are trying to remember, right?
Exactly.
I would say we were very lucky with the timing and how fast staff responded, that I was able to get on the phone with 911 within a minute of being told, and then the police dispatched into downtown and identified the individual right away. That was very fortunate for us.
Yes, it is fortunate. Also, just to have an image of the person. And once again, this is a question for the attorneys, but would we be violating any privacy issues? You know, not everybody on the staff and nobody in the library is going to know who these people are that they should be looking out for.
Aside from a very specific description and the name, that's all we have in either case, from
Okay.
all or now.
How hard or how disruptive or how illegal would it be to have a photo taken for surveillance? So we can have that in a place that is not viewable by the public and say this.
Libraries have that. That absolutely is allowable. I thought the question was going to be, can we share that with other groups that reside in this building? That we cannot do.
We cannot.
No, because it is library information. As with regards to the right to privacy, unless there was a warrant for arrest and there was police work, but the library staff, library employees follow our library policy manual and our personnel manual, which is in support of the privacy of the patron. So if I was in downtown Glen Ellen and there was a banning of an individual and we wanted to tell the restaurant across the street, we couldn't do that.
Interesting. You couldn't tell somebody even if they're in the same building. It's a violation of appearance.
Well, because
Because
they're not our
they'll be
employees, they're not our employees. So that's where a very detailed description comes into play. But as a director, I very much support the discussion of security cameras.
And I think, Jeannie, the question about photo being with maybe the individual's name,
It's
physical description, right? Because a photo is not going to tell you height, let's just say, is in practice in other libraries, and I think will help with any follow-up action required by the staff, because then, you know, things can fall through the cracks, right? When there's not readily accessible, you know, whether it's something that pulls out here, you know, a name and a description in a filing cabinet isn't going to support a swift response to somebody violating a suspension. So,
Times we live in.
yeah, it's sad. So in regard to security cameras, it actually is something that Renee and I discussed, because she said, you know, there are no security cameras in the building, and I was like, okay, got it, built in the 70s, I think.
They didn't exist.
Yeah.
There are other reasons, though, I could see it being helpful. We have an outdoor garden, and we talk about, we actually have a lock on our hose to inhibit anybody from utilizing the village water, because we have our water paid for as utilities through the village of Lake Bluff. Staff have to unlock the hose every time they want to use it. So that only staff are allowed to utilize it. So we could have a smartly positioned camera on the property as well, on the west side of the property to help us assess vandalism or just.
I just think. Knowledge that there are cameras out there squelches a lot of stillness.
I think there may also be, the possibility of cameras supporting swift response if there's a medical emergency. Just say someone's, by themselves up on the second floor. I don't know, what happened? The person may not know. We'll have this or.
Internal procedures for libraries that follow them require regular walkthroughs of the building when you have different areas that are out of line of sight. So especially something, a really large library that spans across an entire floor or maybe 2 floors, staff are regularly walking around that floor. We don't have a schedule of walkabouts in our library. And we have an entire second floor that is out of our line of sight. So as we continue to discuss safety improvements, there are internal procedures I'd like to see staff take on as well.
I don't know if anyone here is on the technology committee. I am no longer on the technology committee. Okay,
So I can pass this message on. to the technical committee.
that would be great. And
What
you know, I don't know when the next technology meeting is scheduled, but perhaps we can at least identify vendors and get some initial estimates and get them.
I think a great place.
Be
to-
nice to know ballpark, what's the number, and we have some reserve if we have to use it. That's, I think, a good investment.
I
It's
can, sorry.
I was just gonna say, it's unfortunate, it's not something like, oh, look, better. Brighter, prettier, but safer is good too.
Well, and like with the water heater replacement from this year, public don't see that improvement, but it is an enhancement of our efficiency, of our ability to provide service to the community, and this only increases our ability to increase the safety of the building and our services. Whatever,
Aren't there life safety grants?
absolutely. There could be other opportunities for funding that Bonnie and I talked about, really, with the Lake Forest Bank. But the other place I want to start is the village. See what vendors they use for their surveillance cameras, the park district and so forth. Talk to the police. So I think we have a lot of I have a lot of strong relationships with these community partners, and that would be another helpful place to start. So what I'll do is I will bring this information to the technology committee at our first meeting of the new fiscal year. Share the board's recommendation, and then prioritize the research that is needed for the proposal.
Thanks, Jamie. Any other thoughts, comments on security cameras? Any other topics for other business? Okay, and I'd be looking for a motion to adjourn just before our library closes.
So moved.
Okay, Janie adjourns to move at 8:57. Do I have a second?
A second.
Awesome. All those in favor? Aye. All opposed to adjourning? Abstain? The ayes have it. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you all for your flexibility. to make this